After the great changes of the Social Security Act and other programs of the New Deal that we studied in Chapter 9, um, the World War II, of course, had broken out and came to an end in 1945. And as we talked about at the end of the last section, which I know was some weeks ago, you may recall the veterans were coming home, and there was a great deal of social pressure on women to leave the workforce and return to the home. And there are many people who believe that those days were sort of the um, opening days of the women's movement, that the women's movement found its new life in during the war years, because women really understood during that period of time that they could function independently if they had the opportunity in the workforce. Really didn't need to have a man taking care of them, and so we would say the seeds were sown during that era for the women's movement, which was to come to fruition in the very strongly in the 1960s and the 1970s. Likewise, in that same era, African Americans who generally were last hired, first fired, all through the history since the Emancipation Proclamation. Nonetheless, were also needed in the factories and found more economic success during the war than they had previously. And so, at the time that the veterans return from overseas and begin to reclaim their jobs, there's an effort also to push African Americans out of the workforce more, and the seeds of change were also sown for the civil rights movement, I believe, during those days. And throughout the 1950s, the 1960s, and on into the 1980s, efforts were made really to achieve equal rights and to end discrimination in many different segments of our society. And so this chapter in the Phyllis Day text covers the era of the civil rights movement and the welfare rights movement, and she refers to it as a new reform era. I have several slides here that will tell you a little bit about what was going on in economics and the social sphere during the years following World War II. For one thing, the real disposable income, that is our purchasing power, doubled from the period of time at the beginning of the Second World War until 1970. The gross national product, now I believe we refer to it as a gross domestic product, and I'm not really sure what the difference is, but in those days it was the GNP. The GNP rose by 10 times during this same period of time, and the gross national product became nearly $1 trillion. And if you remember back to the early weeks of our class, you'll remember that one of the factors that determines whether or not social welfare programs are implemented and how many programs, let's say, are put in place is the amount of money that's available in the economy. So with the GNP rising so much, there was an increase in social welfare expenditures during this period of time. And yet, the poverty rate for African Americans still remained 3 times that of white Americans. And 32%, nearly 1/3 of all non-white populations lived below the poverty line in 1970 still. Non-white unemployment was more than twice that of whites, and for non-white teens, the unemployment rate was more than 4 times that of the adult white population. So you can see that as there was an economic boom, much like other periods of time in our history, the benefits of the economic expansion were not shared equally in our population, and racial minorities in particular and other poor individuals didn't share in the good times. But interestingly, during this period of time, the overall poverty rate decreased, and there were different reasons for that. And we'll talk about the significance of this in a moment, but among the reasons why the overall poverty rate decreased was that there was an increase in wages and earnings overall in the economy during that period of time. There was more money, wages were going up some. There were more women earning in the labor force. Some women had stayed in the workforce, so there were more workers and there was more money coming into the household. So we began to see more two-income households during this period of time. And greater mobility because of the automobile and better mass transit also allowed individuals to move around, to take jobs in other parts of the city or to move to other parts of the country where work might have been more plentiful. But one of the other things that is kind of a hidden feature of social welfare programming that a lot of people don't realize is the fact that the poverty rate also decreased because of the various income transfer programs which were implemented following the New Deal and the Social Security Act in 1935. Well, veterans benefits, the GI Bill, as we had talked about in a few weeks back, if you'll recall, helped the veterans to reintegrate into society economically, kept them out of the workforce for a period of time, but still gave them some money, and then also funded them in terms of going back to school or buying houses or establishing themselves in business or in a farm, those kinds of things. And so veterans benefits, really, a lot of people think that the GI Bill was one of the reasons why the middle class became such a strong part of American life in the 1950s, and why America of the 1950s is kind of seen as this sort of economic nirvana where everybody was happy. It really wasn't that way, but nonetheless, that's sort of the image we have of that period of time. And because our poverty rate was going down and there was more money, and a lot of the reason had to do with the fact that veterans were enjoying these benefits post-World War II. Likewise, we had other entitlement programs that we didn't have previously, such as unemployment compensation, workers' compensation, Social Security for retired individuals, the aid to families with dependent children, that should be AFDC, not ADFC. All of these programs put money in the hands of individuals who wouldn't otherwise have it. And so with these public assistance programs, these entitlement programs, income transfer programs, there is more money in the economy to be spent, and so it is of benefit to the economy to have these individuals have these funds. A significant development in 1946, this is again right near the beginning of this era, was that the Council of Economic Advisors was created. And you'll hear about this if you listen to the news when there's discussions of the economy. And this is a group of individuals who advise our government, our federal government, our leaders about how best to deal with things regarding, the unemployment rate, fiscal and monetary policy, and those kinds of things. So the government, with the creation of the Council of Economic Advisors, began to consciously use fiscal and monetary policy and the federal budget to manage the economic stability of our nation. And they do that through the control of employment, production rates, price levels, those kinds of things. They can really, the unemployment rate in many respects is able to be manipulated through economic policy, and this is the group that helps to advise the government about that, whether to let unemployment rise or to fall. The unemployment rate, the discussion about the unemployment rate these days, there are reasons why some individuals in the business world, let's say, wouldn't necessarily want to see the unemployment rate get too good. If you remember from our early days in this class, the fuller the employment, the more wages are going to go up. And so a high unemployment rate has the effect of keeping wages down. And in a time of tough economic times, such as we experience, in the early 2000 teens, so to speak, low wages isn't such a bad thing. And so while there's a lot of pressure from an individual level on the government to lower the unemployment rate and create more jobs, from the production standpoint, let's say from the power elite standpoint, a higher unemployment rate may be of some benefit because it enables them to maintain better profits. So this is just the kind of the tip of the iceberg, and I am not an economist, and so I really, I'm not qualified to go into great detail in describing this, but just suffice to say that the government can manipulate all of these kinds of things in order to bring about the most favorable economic condition for the nation. After the war, the federal government for the first time really began to recognize responsibility to those with lifetime attachments to the workforce. You'll recall the federal government long ago recognized the debt that it owed to veterans of its wars, and so had taken on federal assistance programs for the veterans and through various forms. Now the federal government has accepted responsibility for taking care of the people who have contributed to the economy throughout their lifetime, and so the Social Security Act really is what that's all about. And during this period of time, the Social Security Act grew to include coverage for disabled workers. We had talked about this a few weeks ago, and also added health insurance for retired individuals through Medicare. But at the same time, organized labor, you remember the unions have been, for the last 100 to 150 years of the history, had really been involved in social change and in advocating for improvements in the conditions of the poor and workers and those kinds of things. But through the implementation of the New Deal programs and a lot of the changes that occurred in the 1930s and 1940s in terms of the 40-hour work week and collective bargaining laws and workers' compensation, child labor laws, those kinds of things, unions really kind of achieved the kinds of changes that they were looking for. And as a result, organized labor really begins to focus upon maintaining the status quo much more than being involved in any kind of social change. And so really at least up until the modern day, I would say that the labor unions have continued to be more focused upon workers and worker rights and improving the conditions of those already employed, and not really dealing much with the circumstances surrounding the poor. In this era, employment was increasingly seen as the solution to poverty. This has been the theme throughout our history and social welfare in this nation, certainly, but once again, a renewed effort to implement employment programs and employment training in order to find some resolution to poverty, or so it was thought. So the government really focuses upon developing employability through different kinds of counseling and training and work incentives in their programs. The cause of poverty definitely was seen as being individual once again. We had reached some sort of recognition of the fact that there were structural causes for poverty during the Great Depression, but as Phyllis Day talks about that pendulum swing, and once again we sort of go into this period of denial about the structural reasons for poverty because the economy is doing so well and working so well for so many people, that those who weren't getting along well, it was just kind of felt that it was really their issue, their fault for that, because it was working well for so many other people. And a social work profession really kind of really kind of wasn't involved in any sort of advocacy for the poor or challenging the social structure at all, but really social work training very much focused upon casework and therapeutic interventions to address the problems of the individual, not to change society. As mentioned earlier, the Aid to Dependent Children program from the Social Security Act, ADC, became AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, because the caretaker was added to the grant. The mother who was unemployed was added to the grant. Now, this has a sort of a psychological effect upon society in a sense, or the public in a sense, because the focus now suddenly is we're actually providing some funds to the unemployed parent as well as to the children of those unemployed parents. And so a great deal of focus gets placed upon that mother, largely, not working, rather than the fact that this program is helping children from poor families. And so there's quite a backlash to dependency, and some people believe that the welfare rolls grew because of the fact that the caretakers were added to their grants, and that's not really the reason that public assistance rolls grew, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But there really was a focus, a belief upon the work ethic, and also a sense that the economic growth that the society was enjoying would end poverty if we could just let it be, and so a lot of people just really continued to believe that public assistance was harmful and that poverty was individually created. It was an individual fault. Politically, during this period of time, it was a very scary period in the 1950s. You might have heard about the Red Scare or the Red Menace of the 1950s. Senator Joe McCarthy from Wisconsin and many others led this period, I think a very dark period in our history, that where individuals were called out of all sorts of places of industry and in the film industry and in public employment and everything. There was this witch hunt for communists in government and communists infiltrating our businesses, and it really is something that is worth reading about if you like American history at all. This is something that you should read, because it's a period of time where just innuendo, one person saying they think another person might have attended a communist meeting 20 years before, was enough to have that person labeled, and individuals' careers were terribly destroyed through all of this. It was really an ugly period of our history. And McCarthy referred to the Roosevelt and Truman administration and the social programs of those two administrations as 20 years of treason. Now, the AFDC rolls did increase during this period of time, and there were a lot of other factors aside from the caretaker being added to the grant that could explain that. For one thing, the population increased. Secondly, there was an increase in the divorce rate following the Second World War and the veterans coming back. I think, again, maybe the early stages of the women's movement, social change was underway, and women were beginning to feel as though they could function more independently, and so the divorce rate was increasing. There were more out-of-wedlock births as well, and a lot of the farm workers were displaced from working in agriculture and moved to the cities, and so there were a lot of different reasons why there was more of a demand for public assistance during this period of time. Again, these are some of the structural reasons, not individual fault, that individuals needing public assistance, poverty, in other words, might have increased during this period of time. But because of this backlash that was going on, not only the Red Scare, but just this general backlash against public dependency, and with the civil rights movement gaining steam, some concern about racial minorities also among the challenging the status quo. Program administration with the AFTC program really became pretty vicious in many ways, and the AFTC worker was sanctioned to use, and usually her, but it could be his own authority in determining whether or not a person was suitable to raise kids. And the AFTC worker was actually the person who made decisions about whether children stayed in homes or not. We didn't really have child protection laws at that point yet, and so social services were provided by the same person who was providing the check, so to speak. And so this individual had a lot of control over these families, and they would determine whether or not an individual was suitable as a parent based in large part upon that person's lifestyle, and that was based upon, of course, the value system of the social worker, who generally were white middle-class women, as I said. And so it was again, not an era that I think social work can be proud of as far as this program is concerned. If there was a man in the house, for instance, that was enough to take somebody's check away. The assumption then was that there was somebody there earning money, and that the woman was not living alone and wasn't dependent, was defrauding the government more or less. And the workers would actually make midnight raids. I mean, literally going to the house at night and demanding to be let in, and looking to see who was sleeping with who, checking closets to see if men's clothing were there, men's shoes, even looking at cigarette butts in the ashtray and whose cigarette butts are these, those kinds of things. It was just a terrible time for recipients in that period of time because of the backlash against public dependency. The civil rights movement, as I said, was beginning to gain steam during this period of time, and just some of the early years of the civil rights movement, during the Eisenhower administration, which was most of the 1950s, the Some of the demographic things that were going on during this period included the middle class moving to the suburbs, kind of leaving the inner cities, and so the inner cities were seeing an immigration of people of color and the poor, individuals that didn't have a lot of transportation, for instance, and things like that might move into the city where the work was more close by. But the middle class was leaving the city, and so you had this separation, this widening gap between the races and the social classes that really became more evident in the 1950s. One very large landmark Supreme Court decision, and we will talk about other Supreme Court decisions later in a few more slides, but one of the biggest ones during this period of time was Brown versus Topeka. This was an order of the I believe it was still the Earl Warren Court, and Earl Warren was the Chief Justice in 1954, and this ruling overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. If you remember, Plessy versus Ferguson said in 1896 that separate was okay as long as the separate facilities were acceptable, as long as they were equal, and Brown versus Topeka says separate in and of itself dictated that equal was not possible, and so the separate but equal policy, let's say, of the government, that was essentially that that legalized and institutionalized segregation was overturned by Brown versus Topeka. This was the end of the era of legal segregation. Well, by law. In fact, I believe that it was the next year, I think in 1955, the court had to issue another ruling that said to schools and other organizations, listen, we really mean this, and I believe the term was the orderly desegregation of schools or something like that was ordered, but the institutions of society were told, you got to get with it, and with appropriate haste or whatever, start making these changes. Brown versus Topeka Board of Education overturned legalized segregation, or ended it, I should say. And as we found during this period of time with the Supreme Court rulings, people, the institutions of society and different segments of a culture were very, very slow to respond to this. And what we learned, well, I can remember even listening as a boy during this period of time and listening to the news that, them talking about de facto segregation and de jure segregation. And this is sort of the difference, that when a law changes, it doesn't necessarily mean that the society's behaviors change until it's really enforced. And the civil rights legislation was just so complex, and there were so many different layers of issues related to it, whether it was a state responsibility or federal responsibility, those kinds of things, that the laws would change, but it would still be years before behaviors were changing. And so de facto segregation means this is what's really going on. De jure means by law. So de jure segregation, when, like under Plessy, there was de jure segregation, but when that was outlawed by Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, de facto segregation continued in many pockets of society all around the country. And as a result of this, the militancy of the civil rights movement begins to grow because of the ineffectiveness of the court decisions, and organizations begin to form. CORE and SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. That was the organization that Martin Luther King was the head of for much of the 1950s and 60s. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. SNCC was really tried to coordinate with Dr. King and the SCLC, but became very frustrated with Dr. King's tendency oftentimes to back away from confrontation in certain situations. The SNCC was much more impatient, I think, as an organization, and kept pressuring the Southern Christian Leadership Conference to move forward with things. It's a very interesting kind of interaction in history, and if you ever get the opportunity to watch the Eyes and the Prize series, you'll see a lot about the interactions between the SCLC and SNCC. The Nation of Islam was now the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and SNCC both focused upon nonviolent means of protest. So that it was civil disobedience was the primary mode of protest, I suppose you'd say, kind of along the lines of Gandhi's theories and practices. So the sit-ins at lunch counters and the freedom rides and the different kinds of things that they would do where they would passively resist the laws which enforced oppression and things like that. That nonviolent civil disobedience was the technique used by Dr. King and his followers. The Nation of Islam, however, preached a different kind of a thought. It was a much more militant kind of intervention, and in many respects was very separatist, whereas SCLC sought to integrate the racial minorities into the larger society and have them benefit from their interactions and integration into society. The Nation of Islam, in many respects, was more of a separatist movement, a black separatist movement, and they really their primary leader was Elijah Muhammad, but the person who became very well known in American society during this period of time was Malcolm X, and he was something of a spokesman for them until, there was a falling out, and Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam. And in fact, there are many people. I believe it may have even been demonstrated that Malcolm X, when he was assassinated, I think in 1965, that there were other people within the Nation of Islam who actually arranged for his murder. But the Black Panther Party was also another more militant organization that actually grew out of the voting rights movement in Alabama in the mid 1960s. So many different organizations began to develop to encourage along the development of civil rights. At the same time, of course, it's not surprising probably to find that the Ku Klux Klan becomes energized and strengthened as sort of a backlash to the changes that the civil rights movement was proposing. And the responses to these kinds of things included marches and demonstrations, the freedom rides, like you saw in the video of the Freedom Riders in last week's Learning Unit, I hope. Sit-ins, other acts of nonviolent civil disobedience. And there were some outbreaks of violence in the cities that developed in the 1960s as well. So reforms begin to happen on a legislative basis because of the social pressure that is brought to bear upon the government. And during the Kennedy and Johnson administrations and throughout the 1960s, there were some changes that started under the Kennedy administration. It's interesting because John Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy were associated very much with civil rights. Was seen as friends of the civil rights movement, and in fact gradually became that. But John Kennedy, particularly during his administration, he was elected in 1960 and was due to be reelected in 1964. He was up to be reelected, and he really didn't want the civil rights movement to push things quite as much as they were during his first administration, because he knew that he relied upon the Southern Democrats to be reelected, and the Southern Democratic Party was not in favor of civil rights. They were really kind of a bunch of old guard, status quo individuals that really believed in segregation and didn't want to see the status quo upended in the South. And so Kennedy really would have preferred not to have to deal with civil rights issues in his first administration because he was concerned that it threatened his chances for re-election. But events occurred, and he was forced to kind of get out in front of it more or less, and eventually did so. There was some funding provided for social work education during the Kennedy years, but it really was focused upon the development of ways to address individual problems that led to poverty and those kinds of things. It wasn't a forward-thinking kind of social work legislation, as far as I could tell, at least. And the civil rights legislation began during the Kennedy years, but he was assassinated in November 1963, about 2.5 years into his first term, and there wasn't much legislation passed before his death. It was until after he was dead that the legislation passed, and I believe, in fact, it was really quite stalled in Congress at the time of his death. But Lyndon Johnson, who came from the Senate, and he was Kennedy's vice president, so he became president when Kennedy was assassinated. He had been a very powerful senator and knew how to work the Senate, and perhaps kind of played on the sympathies at the time following the Kennedy assassination and the nation's grief. Civil rights became a much more popular cause, and Johnson was able to push through a number of changes in legislation in the early 1960s through the middle of 1960s, and you can see the list here, and we're going to talk about each of these. First, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and this was an historic moment, and which incidentally occurred. Martin Luther King's speech, the "I Have a Dream" speech on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, was in August of 1963, and so it was following that time that the Civil Rights Act was passed, the first Civil Rights Act, and declared that it was unlawful to apply unequal standards in voter registration. It indicated that discrimination and segregation in places of public accommodation was declared illegal. It encouraged the orderly desegregation of schools, and the U.S. government gained the authority to enforce these things through the Attorney General's office on a legal standpoint, through civil, looking at trying people on civil rights violations, and through the withdrawal of federal funding. That if agencies or governments or programs didn't follow along and continue to practice segregation or whatever, if they received any federal funding, they could lose that federal funding through this act. In 1965, Lyndon Johnson pushed through a Voting Rights Act, which clarifies further things regarding problems, particularly in the South, regarding African Americans having an opportunity to vote. And there was quite a confrontation going on in the South, Alabama and Mississippi in particular, about voting rights and rights to enroll in school and those kinds of things. And so one of the things that they would do as the laws required that all citizens be allowed to vote, and African Americans were citizens, of course, was that local rules would include things like your grandfather had to have been able to vote in order for you to be eligible to vote. Well, that wouldn't happen, of course, with many African Americans. Some had to take a literacy test, and as we already know, African Americans historically have been denied equal access to education, and so many of them were uneducated. Pay poll taxes, living poor lives. They didn't have an opportunity to pay taxes, and so these kinds of things that were put in place, that if you had to pass literacy tests and pay a tax in order to vote. And so the Voting Rights Act of 65 outlawed literacy tests and poll taxes, and essentially ended legalized segregation. And by enfranchising the blacks, we're talking about the blacks really getting the vote throughout the South. And in many areas where there was quite a concentration of African American population, whites still ran the government in those areas, and so this really began to upend the white control in those areas of the South. In terms of poverty, Congress passed the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964 and focused upon areas where poverty was concentrated, and there was sort of some radical elements to the Economic Opportunity Act in that rather than giving federal funds to local governments, because they've been doing that already, and having those governments distribute the funding to causes and persons and agencies that they felt most appropriate, sort of, continuing to contribute to the status quo. What the Economic Opportunity Act did was to provide money to community action agencies. It kind of bypassed the local governments and put the money in the hands of the community action agencies, so that the social workers, the activists, let's say the individuals working for social change, could determine how best to use those funds. Now, the purpose of this was really intended to kind of calm things down, because some violence had begun to erupt, and some riots in cities had begun to occur, and so the Economic Opportunity Act was intended to calm these riots and provide jobs and training to those people that were most likely to rebel, the poor and the racial minorities, and it certainly did have the effect of quelling the rebellion with these benefits. But what happened is the leaders of the community action agencies were kind of co-opted into local governments and things like this, and so in the end, local governments still managed to find ways to manipulate and control this monies, and so there really wasn't as much change as was theoretically going to occur because of this. And in the end, there was no change in the individual fault casework mentality. It just didn't change as much as it had been hoped that it would. The Social Security Act saw some amendments. In 1964 and 1965, we saw Title 18, the Medicare Act, put in place. This was a non-means tested method of providing health insurance for the retired individuals, persons on Social Security retirement, and Medicaid was passed the following year, Title 19. That is a means-tested health insurance program that you have to qualify because of poverty for this type of health insurance, and Medicaid is generally associated and connected to people who receive AFDC, and even to this day to the TANF funds, the public assistance funds, and SSI. In 1967, payments and services were split in the Social Security Act, and so what this did in effect was to take, remember I was telling you about the all-powerful public assistance worker who could go into homes and make determinations about whether people were fit or not. What this did was it split payments and services so that public assistance agencies would have workers who focused upon eligibility for public assistance, the dollars and cents piece, the check, and other workers would focus upon things like providing basic social services and child protection and those kinds of things. So funding was split there, and the idea being not to mix payments and services. Job training and employment was still the number one priority. The big job program for welfare recipients during that period of time was the WIN program, the Work Incentive Program. They also added this thing called the 30 and 1/3 income disregard and AFDC eligibility. This was intended to encourage welfare recipients to go to work, and if you went to work, when you sat down with your public assistance worker, the first $30 of your earnings, and understand, $30 wasn't a lot of money in those days, but it meant a lot more than it does today. So the first $30 of your income and then the next 1/3 of your income were disregarded when determining AFDC eligibility. In other words, it was just kind of removed from the income figure that you used to determine how eligible you were, so that the idea was that a person who went to work would have an incentive to work because they could get more money that way, because that part of the income was disregarded in determining eligibility. That was only earned income, though, by the way. I don't have that on my slide. This is not like if somebody was giving you money, that didn't count. This was only for earned income disregard, so that was about work. The final piece of legislation that Phyllis Day talks about, I believe, is the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which It's just as a way to show, you have to keep defining where equal rights are and what civil rights means. And here we are over the course of 4 or 5 years throughout the 60s, new laws having to be passed to plug the holes, let's say, in as far as compliance goes around the nation. And the Civil Rights Act of 1968 extended civil rights into housing and forbade housing discrimination based on race. Now, Martin Luther King would have told you, and others would have told you, that in fact, to this day, that discrimination based on race still continues in housing through many different kinds of techniques and practices of real estate agents practice, but that's for another discussion. Oops. The Supreme Court was very busy during this period of time too, and so here's a list of some Supreme Court decisions. You notice I put just for the sake of reminding you, let's say, the Dred Scott decision of 1857 and the Plessy decision of 1896. Those two decisions we've already talked about, but I added them here just so you could kind of put them in context of the other decisions. And as I mentioned earlier, Brown versus Topeka Board of Education. In 1954, the ruling of the Supreme Court said separate could not be equal. So it overturned Plessy, the separate but equal, in 1896. In 1966, Miranda versus Arizona. You've heard about the Miranda warning. You have a right to an attorney. You have a right to be whatever silent. I'm happy to say I don't really remember as much as I watch Law and Order. I can't think of the words for it right now, but basically, you're advised of your rights if you're arrested. Miranda was the act or the ruling of the Supreme Court that gave suspects the right to be advised of their rights at the time of their arrest and to be told that they're being arrested. In 1967, in the Loving versus Virginia decision, laws against interracial marriage were outlawed, and I don't remember her maiden name, but Mrs. Loving, I believe, and her husband, well, they left Virginia because Virginia had laws against interracial marriages, and the term for that was used in the 1950s and 60s was miscegenation, interracial marriages, and so miscegenation was illegal in several states. And so I think Mrs. Loving was black and Mr. Loving was white. Could have it backwards, but I believe that's the way it is. They left Virginia to get married in another state where interracial marriage was not prohibited, and then eventually moved back and were living in Virginia when the police, I guess, literally woke them up one night, got them out of bed, and arrested them for their interracial marriage. And so the Supreme Court declared in 1967 that laws against interracial marriages were not constitutional. And so it's another step in civil rights improvements. 1967, the Galt decision affects the rights of juvenile offenders, and the Galt decision is the reason that juvenile offenders have a right to an attorney, have a right to confront their accusers, and et cetera, just like an adult does. If you remember when the juvenile courts were established in the early 1900s, I believe we talked about the judges kind of acting in, I believe the term was in parens patriae, is sort of in the place of the parent, so that if little Albert got picked up off the streets for shoplifting when he was 13 years old, the judge could decide to put him in detention until he was 21. Because he didn't have a proper parent, let's say, and so, or because he felt that that he was going to get into more trouble, and kind of like grounding him to detention for the next 8 years. Well, if as an adult you shoplifted, you might your penalty would be much less than that. And so, what the Galt decision basically said is that what happens to juveniles has to be parallel with what happens to adults in the system, and juveniles should have the same rights as adults when they're accused of a crime. So the idea of the courts kind of taking on the parental role with children was modified quite a bit. Now, juvenile court still has different philosophies from the adult correction system, but again, that's something that we can talk. I think we'll talk about that later in the semester. And although it's sort of outside this time frame because this period theoretically ends in 1970 that we're studying, in 1973, Roe versus Wade, this is the decision where the Supreme Court struck down the laws prohibiting abortion around the United States, and this is a law that is still very much under review by the courts. The current Supreme Court is thought to be rather conservative, and should the law regarding Roe v. Wade, should abortion laws be, in fact, it has been modified some already over the years, but there are still people who are hoping to bring Roe versus Wade back before the Supreme Court and have Roe versus Wade overturned. Most of the justices have said that Roe versus Wade is sort of established law, and that it's not something that is open for review any longer. It's just the way it is. But really, when you look at Plessy versus Ferguson, it was in place for 58 years before it was overturned. So I would think that was probably considered established law at that time too. And so this is something worth watching in the years ahead, what the Supreme Court does with abortion rights. Lyndon Johnson, when I think it was in it might have been his first State of the Union address in 1964, but certainly by 1965 had declared what he called a war on poverty. He envisioned a great society. That was the name of his programs, the Great Society programs, and the war on poverty was a part of that. And he wanted to, Lyndon Johnson really wanted to kind of take Roosevelt's programs and bring them more into fruition, to really bring the New Deal and integrate it into the lives of Americans much more thoroughly than it had been. And in a sense, of course, the backlash that had been struggling against that, he saw himself as somebody who was going to more or less save the New Deal and see that it got implemented fully. And so his legislative program to end poverty in the United States included the Social Security Act amendments that we had talked about earlier, several different job training programs such as the Work Incentive Program, CETA, which is the Comprehensive Employment and Training Act, and this is something I think we talk about more next week. It was really a very interesting program for providing training opportunities for unemployed, low-income individuals from poor neighborhoods and things like this, and was really quite creative, in fact. The Job Corps still exists today, but it was much more a much larger presence in the 1960s than it has today. Many different anti-poverty programs through the Office of Economic Opportunity. The Office of Equal Opportunity, which grew out of the legislation that we had talked about in 1964, that was the Economic Opportunity Act, Head Start, Upward Bound. Food stamp program was established. Actually, I think it got started during the Kennedy administration, but more fully implemented during Johnson's administration. The food stamp program really was, and now it's here we have. They don't have stamps anymore. They don't have cards anymore. They have, they don't have those things that look like funny money. Now you have like an ATM card you swipe, and I think it's called Quest in Alaska, and but the food stamp program was a Department of Agriculture program, and the intent of this food stamp program was to redistribute surplus food to the needy. That should say redistribute surplus food to needy, not on needy. But it also provides support for the farmers because that gave the farmers some other place to send food and things like this. So it's also a subsidy for farmers, and that's why it's a program of the United States Department of Agriculture. My first job out of college was certifying individuals for food stamps in Central Florida. The Mental Health Acts increased funds for training of social workers, and also the Department of Housing and Urban Development was established under Lyndon Johnson HUD, which was also, I think its intent is fairly obvious from its title. More schools offering social work education And some of those schools really focused upon things like community organizing and social issues. And so there was a bit of a return to something of a kind of, well, they called it radical social work in those days. And there were, in fact, some schools that called themselves radical social work schools. But by and large, most of the social work schools continued to focus upon training individuals for casework and individual interventions, and using Freudian and neo-Freudian kinds of theories of personality development to understand the human condition. It really, by and large, the social work profession, while there was, an opportunity there was an opening where it was becoming more activist again in the 1960s, and these are the kinds of things that really was encouraged in the Johnson administration. The profession as a whole, I think, didn't really adopt that activist mode. And with the loss of the charismatic leaders through assassination, when Malcolm X was assassinated in 1965 and Martin Luther King in 1968, the civil rights movement splintered. When you study basic sociology courses, and you talk about leadership, if you remember, charismatic leadership is one type of leadership. And the problem with charismatic leadership, which is really based upon the strength of the personality of one individual, the leader, when that individual leaves, when that individual dies, oftentimes there isn't anybody that can fill the void that's left by that person, because nobody has the strength of the personality that the leader had. And so organizations led by a charismatic leader, or a movement led by a charismatic leader, may die off after that and splinter. And while the civil rights movement continues, and the SCLC and maybe SNCC, I don't know, CORE, and those organizations continue to exist today, they don't have the oomph, they don't have that enthusiasm that they had in the 1950s and the 1960s, and so they're much more bureaucratized. There's if every now and then you'll read about some infighting going on within the organizations and those kinds of things, and so that's kind of what happens to movements. If there isn't somebody there to energize them, or some new reason, a new cause to energize them. At the time of his assassination in 1968, Dr. King was really kind of moving his focus away from racial oppression and more towards poverty, in fact, and had begun also to look at the war and the Vietnam War, and was involving himself in some anti-war kinds of movements and things. But poverty seemed to be that was going to be the next area for him, and so we don't know what might have happened had he lived, and what other kinds of things might have changed, because most people would agree that he was one of those individuals that probably, as an individual, created great change in our society, and is different. The society is different because of his life. There was an increase in violence throughout the 1960s, and even in the 1980s and 1990s, there have been some instances of racial violence in the cities in different parts around the nation. And so there's been, backlash against the implementation of civil rights programs. And today, the modern day backlash against civil rights really is about affirmative action. And we're going to talk more about affirmative action in another week or so. But late in the 1960s, this backlash to the civil rights movement and those changes, the social changes, it just tremendous social change, and really the civil rights and was just one area of change. The women's movement was very, very prominent during this era, and family systems were beginning to change, and new ways of seeing marriage were beginning to emerge, and new types of families were emerging. And the hippie movement was prevalent during this period of time, and the anti-war movement because of Vietnam was beginning to gain steam also. And if you can imagine a culture in a society turning on the news at night and hearing about all of these things at one time, on the one hand, it was a very exciting period to be in the middle of. But on the other hand, for those individuals who are looking for security and predictability in their lives, it was a very disturbing era. And so all of these kinds of changes, I think this backlash kind of developed against these changes. And what we wound up doing was electing Richard Nixon president in 1968 with on a law and order platform as he campaigned, and so the focus really became law and order and late in this period of time. And Phyllis Day, she says, I think perhaps a little optimistically, but she says civil rights legislation is now a permanent part of the polity, although its enforcement may depend upon the willingness of oppressed people to fight for their rights. And I think our history shows that to be true. And one closing statement that I think is one of these statements, and actually in current editions, this particular quote is no longer in there. She's reworked this quote, and I think this is the best quote, which is the earliest one she had about this thought, so I've kept it. And what she says is, when rebellion threatens, the response is first accommodation, and then, when the force of the movement is dissipated, renewed denial. And what this says is, when a society, or in this particular case our government, is threatened, and there is a concern that the unrest will upend the social order and change the status quo, the response then is to try to address the grievances of the individuals who are threatening to rebel. But when those grievances are addressed and services are put in place and the movement kind of dies down, then we just go back to the way it was before. And this is the cycle that Day talks about in her textbook. And think about this threat, or rather this quote, and what it says in light of some of the reform eras that we have studied over the past several weeks. The progressive era reforms in the early 1900s, when socialism really was threatening our society, at least threatening the status quo. It was thought it might be threatening the status quo. The New Deal, which was the result of the economic collapse and the unrest during the Depression, and the Civil Rights Movement. How each of these periods of time are a good demonstration of this quote. And so, just something for you to think about if you could kind of explain each of those eras through the lens of this quote. I think you could. And so, with that, that's the end of my lecture on this particular chapter. And next we'll be talking about the era following this great change and everything like this. The era begins with Richard Nixon's administration, and Nixon really was. You'll find out was a lot more moderate than we may remember him, and was although he was a Republican, moderate Republicans in many respects were in many ways more progressive than Democrats were in that era. So that's for next week. And so until we speak again, I hope you have a good week.